So I'm going to talk not only about my official title, Repeat Hydrography, but more specifically about observations in Drake Passage, including some repeat hydrography, but also bringing in other observations that we might be able to use to make the hydrography more useful and reduce uncertainties, possibly. So, yeah. So here's a nice plot from the SOOS report of the Go Ship, or what used to be WOS and Clybar, it's now called Go Ship reference sections in the Southern Ocean. And these are the sections that are meant to be repeated at least once a decade, including both physical and biogeochemical measurements. So of these sections, there were recent, in the last couple of years, P16 South and SR2 here south of South Africa were repeated. And most of the others are scheduled to be repeated within the next 5 years. So there'll be another set of full biogeochemical sampling on most of these sections in the next 5 years. And in general, the funding for these, at least for the next 5 years, and these have pretty secure, confirmed or fairly secure funding. So that's good. Some of these sections have repeated more frequently, but generally, or not with the full set of biogeochemical measurements. And in particular, the choke point sections, SR1, SR2, SR3, and also recently A23 has been repeated annually by the British Antarctic Survey. So these decadal surveys have been used to most notably to point out trends in deep water properties. So I should say that one of the main advantages, it's important to increase sampling by autonomous platforms and different types of sampling. But the thing that Go Ship type sampling still gives us, ship-based sampling gives us, is full depth coverage and very high accuracy and high precision measurements. So it's still essential to continue this in order to calibrate float measurements and glider measurements, for instance, and in particular to sample the deep ocean. So here's a plot from the Perky and Johnson paper showing the cold and deep changes in salinity and temperature and attributing them to water mass property changes in this column or isopycnal heave changes in this column. And I'm just showing this to point out that these two drivers appear to have contrasting effects a lot of the time. So that points to the importance of analyzing a variety of measurements in order, if we want to say something about climate trends, so that we're not aliasing in isopycnal heave, and I'll talk about that a little later. There have also been observations of changes in intermediate waters, and I'll get back to that. And then section measurements have also been used in box inverses, most recently maybe by Alberto and collaborators to look at just sort of long-term average volume fluxes of and property fluxes in different water masses. But I don't know if you can see the numbers. These are the uncertainties on these estimates are quite high, obviously because they come from just a few repeats along each section, since these are, again, mostly decadal repeats. So that brings me to Drake Passage, which is, I'll treat a little bit as a stand-in for the other choke points. I'll just talk about Drake Passage, but some of the things that are true here are true at other choke points, although Drake Passage is the shortest. And so because of that, and in Drake Passage, we actually have an annually repeated hydrographic section, as well as quite a number of other observations, some ongoing and some just process studies that are not necessarily ongoing. So that we can try to look at spatial and temporal decorrelation scales in this location and get a better idea of the uncertainty on repeat hydrography, for instance. So I'm going to try to address what what are the variables and a couple of the variables and processes that we can observe using the measurements that are ongoing in Drake Passage, and then what timescales do we need to resolve? Are we resolving what we need to reduce uncertainty, or can we combine different types of measurements or different experiments in Drake Passage to do this? And I'm actually going to skip to this one first, and then I'll ask you to keep it in mind through the rest. So these are the recent measurements. This is from the Meredith et al. Review in 2011 of Drake Passage sustained observing. So the black line here is the SR1B hydrographic section that's been occupied annually in summertime since 1993, or almost every year. So there are 20 complete sections now. At either end, there are bottom pressure recorders and 1,000 meters of water. And so those provide approximately year-long records of bottom pressure and thus of the barotropic transport through the passage. These green lines are tracks of the Lawrence M. Gould, which is the supply ship for Palmer Station on the peninsula. And so it crosses most months, pretty much every month except August, a couple times a month. And since the late 90s or early 2000s, there have been both shipboard ADCP data in the top 300 to 1,000 meters. It's about to 1,000 now, as well as XBT and XCTDs deployed at high resolution on the track about 6 times a year. The blue triangles are the Sea Drake experiments. This is a set of short moorings that were out for 4 years. So current recording, current and pressure recording of bird echo sounder moorings here, and then the red line is the Drake experiment, which is a French and Korean collaboration, and there were tall moorings across the passage at these locations for 2 years for most of the moorings. It was a turnaround midway through, and in most of the moorings there were temperature, salinity, and current meter measurements at about 3 depths. And then, of course, there are other observations available here. They won't talk about as much, but Argo and satellite observations are something we can bring in as well. So the green lines and the black line, those programs are ongoing, and I would say the bottom pressure recorders and the hydrography is likely to continue, as is as are the Gould measurements. The Sea Drake moorings were out from 2007 to 2011, and these Drake moorings were out from, I think, 2008 to 2009, or a 2-year period that partly overlapped that. So it's just a schematic. So for all of these different types, these different measurements have different resolutions and different lengths. So the bottom pressure recorders are switched out every year. So we don't have a continuous record over the 20 years. So basically they can resolve very short scale things all the way up to seasonal variability. However, they can also be used to learn something about longer time scale variability, the portion of longer time scale variability that involves the modulation of the seasonal cycle with time. So that's this arrow, which is meant to be a slightly different color here. And then the hydrography is only annually repeated. So, however, it varies slightly as to when in the summer it occurs. So you might guess you could use it to learn something about the seasonal variability, and I'll get to that. I'll come back to that in a minute as to whether we really can use it for that. But because it's just one measurement per year, it's aliasing all sorts of things. The same for the XBT data, although there are at least multiple sections per year. For the shipboard ADCP, again, there are more sections for the XBT, but anything that's derived from the shipboard ADCP will alias some short timescale variability. And then the more data are continuous, but only a few year long records. Argo, as number of Argo floats continues to build up, it'll be easier to use it to look at a longer variety of timescales. But right now I'd say it's about here. And then satellite data also are potentially aliasing quite a bit of eddy and meander variability in this region. So yeah, so none of these measurements is perfect, but can we combine them at all to try to get an idea of what might be aliased in one type? So I'm first going to look at volume or sort of zonal transport, transport by a long stream in the ACC. From some measurements in Drake Passage, recent measurements. So in general, different measurements give broadly consistent results, which is good. So here's if you just look at the black line on this left plot, that's the time series of baroclinic transport from the Sea Drake array. This is from a paper by Maria Paz, Chichidima, and co-authors. The annual average is about 125, 130. It's pretty steady from year to year, but there's quite a large range. It's about half the size of the average within each year. So you can see there's just a lot of variability in time. Then on the right is a plot of transport from the SR1B section. So again, baroclinic transport relative to the bottom. And so there's a fairly similar mean value, but you can see how these once a year measurements would be just aliasing all of this variance here that occurs at a whole range of time scales. This plot over here on the right shows the same transport values as a function of year, day, or month here. And the colors indicate the year. So the red dots are later in the time series. And so there's not a clear seasonal cycle in transport, keeping in mind this is just summer, early summer to late summer. But another thing to notice that is something to keep in mind later is that there's a tendency through the course of the SR1B record for the timing of the cruise to drift later in the summer. And so there's the potential to conflate any seasonal variability, early versus late summer changes with trends. And then this is just a top 1,000-meter transport from the shipboard ACP, so a direct velocity measurement. It's not directly comparable because it's only top 1,000 meters, but again, you see that there's a very large range within each year. If we look at heat transport, so along current heat transport from SR1B on this bottom panel, you do see an indication of a seasonal cycle. Again, this is just early summer to late summer. But again, because SR1B used to be around November to early December, and then recently has been combined with other measurements in March, and now tends to be in January. I think it's hard to disentangle any seasonal cycle from any trends in time. Another metric that might be interesting to monitor from year to year, as well as trend in time, is the position of the fronts. So here's a result from on the right from the XBT time series in Drake Passage, showing variability in front position. So the annual average front positions is from the water properties as the ship crosses the polar front. So sort of interpolating the location of the polar front, and then the intervals, I think, are standard deviations from the several measurements several sections per year. So you can see over this time period in the 90s, so these are from not just the XBT data, but from the 90s on, those provide most of the data, so intervals get smaller. So over this time period, there seems to be a southward shift. If you look on the left, this is cumulative transport from SR1B, which is just downstream of this section in general. And so the polar front would be this jump around this jump in transport here. And here we actually see the opposite. If anything, it's a little confused, but if anything, there's an equatorward shift both over the 90s and even into the 2000s. So some of that may be due to the different criteria for picking the front or the jet. It may have to do with the different locations as well, even though they're relatively close. So now, in a way, the ACC transport is interesting, but in addition, the meridional transport and changes in water properties are maybe even more relevant to questions of what's happening with the climate. So when we look at those, so here I'm comparing variance from the sea drake, so which uses a Gravis empirical mode method based on historical hydrography to reconstruct stratification. So I'm comparing the mean temperature from sea drake to that from SR1B. So again, these aren't on. So this temperature is derived from historical hydrography combined with sound travel time measurements, so the integrated measurement throughout the water column. So these aren't at exactly the same location in space, but you can really see you can see that the GEM method is why it's called the Gravest empirical mode, or that it really is just the Gravest empirical mode. There's I think it stands out that there are differences near the surface. But in addition, there are differences in the deep waters, both in the mean and in the standard deviation in these bottom panels. So this is temperature variability from the sea drake measurements and the GEM, and then temperature variability on SR1B. And those are almost radically different. So this is about the polar front at the sea drake latitude, and then on SR1B, it's around here. So there's it's a little hard to see, but there's a slight elevation in variance in both shallow and deep temperature and SR1B, as well as in sea drake around the polar front location. But it's much smaller on SR1B. And I don't think from these data we can tell whether that reflects the rather different timescales that the measurements are being taken on, or if it reflects different dynamics and actual difference in variance in the two locations. So I'm focusing on the upper sort of half of the ocean, or starting near the surface. Stevenson and I used the XPT and XCTD data to look at the surface heat content. And so these dots are the heat in the upper 400 meters, and then the red line would be the seasonal cycle. And the seasonal cycle is well correlated with the seasonal cycle you'd expect from surface fluxes. And in fact, south of the polar front explains most of the variance, but north of the polar front, there's a large residual here that's attributable partly to eddies and meanders. There have also been attempts to look at the seasonal cycle from the distribution of your days of the repeat hydrography in Drake Passage. So here's a comparison between early summer temperature and salinity and late summer temperature and salinity from SR1B, and also from an atlas, which would include SR1B data as well as other data. And here it appears that there might be a seasonal cycle that it extends at least as deep as 1,000 meters. But again, I think we can't tell here whether this signal is actually a seasonal cycle or whether it's aliasing a trend. So despite that, whatever the reason, there's overall an indication of water mass volume changes due to a combination of isopycnal movements, those are these dashed arrows here, and actual water mass property changes, diapycnal transformation, which are the thicker arrows here. When Evans and collaborators were able to separate out from the SR1B and ATLAS measurements the different contributors for different water masses at different seasons to these changes. So that's potentially very interesting, and if because there are both sort of wind-driven isopycnal movement components as well as surface flux-driven diapycnal components. So if we can make these measurements more robust, this could be a really great way to monitor changes in water mass properties, not only sort of linear trends, but also modulation of seasonal cycles in water mass modification and formation in the Southern Ocean. Going to the deep and bottom waters is properties of bottom waters on the SRNB repeat hydrography line in Drake Passage from a paper by Julian and others, and you can see there's interannual variability. There's also a trend over time. So there have been some studies that this variability seems to be correlated with wind over the Weddell with a lag of 5 months. So that's consistent with deep water properties in Drake Passage reflecting variable export of cold water from the Weddell Gyre, which is something that was observed by Mike Meredith and co-authors a while ago. And so that's one possible mechanism for observed correlations with this subantarctic mode, and then so it's would be through wind over the Weddell, changing export of volumes and properties of water exported to Drake Passage. But on the other hand, most of the variance in deep temperature on SR1b, as well as other places in the Southern Ocean, is explained by isopycnal heave, not diapycnal changes in water properties. So it's explained by, in this case, migrations of the ACC fronts in Drake Passage. So this plot shows the average temperature between 3,000 meters in the bottom on SR1b as a function of year. And then here it's the same on the y-axis, but plotted versus a proxy for the frontal position. So sort of the correlation between velocity and F, so where the transport is. So when the fronts move north, it all gets colder. That's what you'd expect. And these are the surface fronts, and this proxy actually explains quite a bit of the variance in deep temperature along this section. And the residual here is much smaller. So that suggests a rather different pathway for the observed correlations between deep temperature in Drake Passage and larger scale wind patterns. So I think overall, I don't really have an answer. The answer is maybe there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done to combine these different types of observations, as well as to attribute changes we see either from year to year or seasonally to any particular cause, even if they're correlated with things that make sense as forcing. And I think this is probably something where numerical models will have to be used. And another possibility is, and this has been touched on, is combining in situ observations with something like with satellite observations to extend time series and extend observations spatially. So this is one example. It's based on the Drake mooring data in Drake Passage, and using transport from that along with satellite sea surface height to create a longer record of ACC transport. And that does produce something that agrees well with in situ estimates, which are the dots in the proxies. The total transport would be the teal proxy here. And similarly, there are like satellite gems, to some extent things like what Uriel and Sarah Gilly are doing are similar. Anything like this, in a way, will capture, it'll probably capture the majority of the variance, because the majority of the variance on a range of timescales is driven by isopycnal heave, or by, in particular, horizontal migrations of the fronts, meanders and eddies. But the thing to keep in mind is that it captures variance that exists in the temperature and salinity space at the time that you make this comparison and construct the proxies. So if there's change in the water mass properties over time, and if that's the signal we're looking for, we won't be able to capture that with this kind of proxy unless we keep can keep making comparisons, keep having other in situ data to compare. So yes, the answer is still, I'm not sure, but I think it would be worth putting more effort into looking into combining process studies with ongoing observations to make the ongoing observations more useful. Thank you.
It's time for a couple of quick questions. Down the back.
I was wondering if you looked at the ocean reanalysis products and how well they do at kind of simulating Drake passage variability.
Yeah, so I've looked at the Southern Ocean State estimate mostly, and it does well at some things. So better than some products, but not as good as the observations at sort of the relative strengths of the subantarctic front and polar front, for instance. So there is spatial variability that's missed. Even with something that's relatively high resolution. There's also, I haven't looked at this, but it'd be interesting to look at to what extent the lower eddy kinetic energy that you see in SOSI is due to the reanalysis sort of constraining to zero a little, or the fact that it's not constraining to variance specifically, so it would tend to constrain to zero. Or to what extent it's due to actually the observations that we can compare to, including all sorts of processes that are not expected to be included in inertial oscillations and what have you, which could actually be important in ACC transport fluctuations. So I don't know.
Okay, do we have one more quick question? Nathan.
So Yvonne, you listed freshwater transport and heat transport as key essential climate variables, and I agree they're very interesting, but actually for detecting climate trends, I would say that they're a noisy variable, and a more interesting one would be just straight measurements of temperature and salinity change, for instance. So do you want to think about that and do you want to recalibrate your statement, or do you want to stick to your guns?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, and I think if we were to choose something to try to measure or improve the measurements of first, then it would probably be just what is the heat content of this section over time. That's easier than saying what is the overturning circulation from a section at a given time, certainly. So.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne.